here so you can just advance that. Perfect. Where John go? Did you scare him away already?
There's a clicker if you need it.
I gotta fix this.
What's that?
I lost it. So. Good morning, everyone. Sorry for we like, particularly in the mornings, to be, right on time, and we're just a couple minutes late. But welcome to the Asia Society. Great to have you here for the November edition of our breakfast briefing series, and delighted to have lured our guests, who are here, by the way, visiting Washington. They've just been at the State Department. I hope that's not off the record. And the United Nations, and are beginning a conference at New York University at NYU downtown. So we were very happy to get a stop up here at the Asia Society for what's really, I was just saying, we do a lot of programs here on North Korea that are all about the strategic side, and in particular, summit meetings, good and bad, missile launches, we just had one overnight, the kinds of things that are typically in the headlines. Today our focus is much more on what sometimes seems a naive thing or a quaint, perhaps Pollyannish approach, but humanitarian engagement in the North, and the potential for more of that, and how it may fit in the broader strategic picture. Just a quick word, really quick, about upcoming events here at the Asia Society. We go from the very serious and strategic here to some light fare that is coming in the next 24, 48 hours. Those of you who want to make a return visit tonight, it's our first Friday Leo bar in conjunction with the Diwali holiday. That will involve drink and activities, free admission to the galleries, a lot of great food and events associated with the holiday. And then tomorrow afternoon, really one of the more fun things we do here. It's a family event, but yeah, if somebody can shut that phone, it's bad enough to listen to me once. But 1 to 5 is our family day. The Asia Society, it's called Diwali Lights Up Asia Society, and it's meant for kids, but I've been here enough to know the adults have a pretty good time too. And that gets going at 1 in the afternoon tomorrow. As always, for all our events, go to asiasociety.org for more information. So to the program here, as I said, NYU is convening a conference with people who are working behind the scenes, beyond those headlines, you might say, providing humanitarian assistance, promoting inter-Korean exchanges, and working in other ways, basically to lower the temperature and reduce tensions on the peninsula. No easy task, no matter what your strategy is. I want to recognize guests who are here from the KSM, the Korea Sharing Movement, which works on these humanitarian and civic engagement areas with North Korea. They hold meetings and conferences with NGOs and IGOs, such as the one at NYU this week. And as I said, that's the occasion that brings our guests here this morning. Dong-Jin Kim, to my left, who will do a presentation in a moment, is Marie Curie Fellow at the Irish School of Ecumenics, not economics, no. Ecumenics.
Very good, you're very
good. At Trinity College in Dublin. He's also a policy advisor for Korean peacebuilding and development NGOs, including the Korean Sharing Movement. He's author of a new book, The Korean Peace Process and Civil Society Towards Strategic Peacebuilding. Great to have you here. And great to welcome back to the Asia Society our friend John Delury. More about that friendship in a moment. Associate Professor of Chinese Studies at the Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies in Seoul. And if his name is familiar, it's because you often find really smart stuff quoted in the mainstream media about particularly those strategic issues I just mentioned, and on North Korea in particular, although he's a China hand as well. Really part of the Asia Society global family and alumnus of our Asia 21 Young Leaders Network, frequent guest at Asia Society in South Korea, co-author with our own Orville Schell of the great book Wealth and Power.
Who boycotted this event for some reason.
He's in California.
He's always in California.
I'd like to say he's watching, but it is 5:30 there. But, Wealth and Power, China's Long March to the 21st Century. And I just have to go off script for a moment. So talk about family and friends of the Asia Society. So John shows me a picture of the North Korea. Can you pull this up, please?
Yeah,
at least
I think it's
of
there.
The North Korean negotiator who was just having talks in Sweden with American officials in early October.
If you
Oh, it's okay. Trust me, though. And John says, look at my tie. So I know that's an Asia Store, Asia Society tie. And then he says, look at the North Korean negotiators tie. And you'll just have to, well, here we go. I don't know, we can pass this around.
Pass Sanjeev's phone
But trust me, this is taken 3 weeks ago, and it's the same tie. I said, how did that happen? Because John Delury gave the North Korean, when did you give it to him?
Well, I don't want to say I personally gave it to him. I don't want the sanctions people coming after me. But Asia Society gave him this tie 10 years ago when he was actually, maybe we were in this room. We had a discussion across the way there with Kim Young-gil, who's now the lead North Korean negotiator in the recent talks in Sweden.
Yeah.
And on his way, he wore the Asia Society tie.
So you talk about how difficult it is to establish, back channel things with the North Koreans. It can all start with a tie bought at our store. So, okay, I was going to say these briefings are informal. You've already figured that out. But I do, Dong-Jin Kim, want to give you a chance because whatever I say about this humanitarian engagement thing, it's much better coming from you. And if you can start with your presentation, and then we'll dive right in.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Yep.
I'm deeply honored to be here to talk about the humanitarian cooperation work by South Korean NGO in North Korea. I know that it's an informal setting, but I just want to briefly be formal about in terms of my overview of the situation in the Korean Peninsula. So, as many of you know, that's the signed papers, as we have seen previously from the Korean peace process that do not make a different sustainable peace-building strategy requires genuine spaces of accessible public engagement and coordination of multiple activities and multiple roles at multiple levels, including the work of humanitarian NGOs. So I'll just skip these bits. But the South Korean aid to North Korea carried undeniable security connotations from the beginning. The South Korean government back in the 90s severely restricted all aid to North Korea, claiming that this was a national security issue. As a response to this, South Korean civil society initiated a nationwide campaign to transform the public image of North Koreans from the enemy to brothers and sisters in need. And the NGO aid to North Korea increased quite significantly after the introduction of the Sunshine Policy by the South Korean government in the late 90s. And in the beginning, North Korea expressed strong antipathy to the Sunshine Policy, calling it a vicious, cunning policy to disarm them. But the progress made in high-level peace process eventually led to expanded civilian-level exchanges, including family reunions, social and cultural exchanges, and aid activities by South Korean NGOs in North Korea. So as the amount of private aid grew, the number of NGOs increased considerably, as you can see. And more NGOs launched humanitarian projects in different sectors of North Korea, such as food security, emergency relief, health and medical, and agriculture, livestock, environment, and capacity building. And interestingly, the interaction between South Korea and North Korea grew through aid projects by the NGOs, and the personal relationships were built between North and South Koreans, as you can see from these photos, and everybody worked together. And you can see the agricultural projects and then joint harvests and such. So all were fantastic. But then the late 2000s, due to North Korean development of nuclear and missile technologies, and then changes of the US and South Korean government policy to North Korea, the tension at the government level increased, and this tension began to negatively affect humanitarian aid to North Korea by the South Korean NGOs. And meanwhile, the assumption and the use of aid to North Korea caused a serious debate within South Korean and international societies. Those who support aid to North Korea argue that engaging with the North is the best way to deter the further development of nuclear weapons or possibly make the North to give up the nuclear weapons. For them, aid to North Korea will ensure security by improving the relationship with the North, and aid cooperation will eventually guide North Korea towards self-reform and improve North Korean human rights. And they argue non-engagement and criticism will only make the regime toughen political oppression. However, those who oppose the aid to North Korea maintain that it will undermine security by giving the failing North the opportunities to survive and to develop more advanced nuclear weapons and missile technologies. And in their view, the best way to build peace is not to improve the inter-Korean relationship by providing aid or negotiating with North Korea, but to walk away from North Korea waiting for regime collapse. They say North Korean regime will never reform itself and aid will only feed the corrupted authoritarian regime. Therefore, they argue that the South Korean government and international community should use sanctions like sticks for the sake of the international security and North Korean human rights instead of providing aid like carrots. So likewise, any debate around NGO aid to North Korea cannot be separated from the other issues surrounding the Korean conflict. The context of the Korean conflict and the different levels of response are what make AD activities in the North all the more complicated. It seems as though this complexity has been lost in the simple yes or no debate based on assumed positivity or assumed negativity. Rarely is the question asked on both sides the how question. How to make aid to North Korea contribute to security, better inter-Korean relations, good governance of North Korea, and improving North Korean human rights instead of making all these worse. So there has been criticisms of the current high-level peace process in that it lacks comprehensive and detailed strategy. It appears that the current strategy by the major parties requires a change of action from North Korea first, particularly denuclearization first, and the other agendas such as humanitarian situation in North Korea could be more seriously addressed. And in order to resuscitate their project, many South Korean NGOs attempted to de-link aid from the complicated context of the Korean conflict. They highlighted the humanitarian needs in North Korea, arguing that their aid was based purely upon humanitarianism, not related to any political agenda. The NGOs claimed that the provision of aid to North Korea should be allowed regardless of setbacks in the high-level peace process because the human rights to adequate food is as important rights as civil and political rights. However, most of these NGOs soon realized that even humanitarian aid could not be separated from the context of the Korean conflict. They found themselves caught between North Korean government prioritizing regime security over the humanitarian needs of their vulnerable population, and the South Korean, US, and UN sanctions against North Korea, which are intended to address the issue of the international security. There is, of course, a humanitarian exemption process. We can talk about it later, but then none of the South Korean NGOs are allowed or able to receive the exemption so far, and the process took cut because the process is too complicated for the South Korean NGOs and take a long time. So I believe that this is why we need to find the strategic overlaps between aid and peace building and ask how to collaborate instead of being stuck in silos and promoting just one value or one goal, such as humanitarian goal, human rights goal, or peace goal, or security goal. These values and goals do not have to be incompatible. For example, humanitarian aid to North Korea is not only for North Korean citizens' basic human rights to adequate food, but a necessary component in building peace on the Korean Peninsula. The aid to address child malnutrition in North Korea is an example. The North Korean children are future partners of the South Korean children in building peace, as well as the future citizen of a united Korea. Considering the current economic disparity and aggressive competition within South Korean society, the disparity between North and South Korean children would significantly undermine any efforts to build peace on the peninsula. Therefore, aid cooperation to address child malnutrition is critical to sustainable peace building on the Korean peninsula. So I believe identifying these strategic overlaps and multilateral cooperations and collaborations in the cause of peace building will allow us to think about how we could do this better together instead of saying yes or no all the time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Just real fast, factual question.
Sure.
Are we right then that there are at the moment no South Korean NGOs operating on the ground in the north?
Almost none of the South Korean NGOs are allowed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. John Delury, you've been, I mean, your focus is not humanitarian engagement, but you have, we were just saying, I mean, for more than a decade, right, been working on various areas. I guess it's that strategic overlap thing of engagement with the North. I believe you were a supporter, at least before the summits happened, of President Trump seeing Kim Jong-Un, even without preconditions or whatever it was. And there's that kind of engagement, there's back channel engagement, there's whatever happened in that room a long time ago. But can you assess in the broader, not just humanitarian, what what fruits have there been, if any, of these various efforts at engagement? I mean, give us a kind of where things stand about all those efforts and where we are now.
Well, it's a great question, although it's hard to measure it. First of all, because I would say for two reasons. One, as the slides that Dong-Jin just showed us, you know, the bulk of this work was being done in terms of outsiders, you know, traveling into North Korea. I was involved with some groups that were at a smaller level were working to bring North Koreans out of North Korea, mostly into China for educational programs and kind of cultural exchanges and that kind of work. Very small level, but really innovative. And especially, say, in those cases, it was the groups themselves were quite young. I mean, my first trip to North Korea was led by some former students of mine at Brown University who started an NGO. This is over a decade ago, saying, why don't we get North Koreans out of North Korea, you know? And they did some extraordinary work. There was another group based out of Singapore called Chosun Exchange that also did that kind of work.
And when you say, sorry, get out of North, you just mean temporarily, right?
Yeah. So this is not, these are not defectors. These are North Koreans who are part of the North Korean system. They would target younger North Koreans. And so with permission, they would spend some time abroad and do these study and exchange programs. So it's kind of a version of what we did at Asia Society with inviting the DPRK folks from the UN mission just to interact more, and you know they can make their positions clear, and the others, experts and others in the room can articulate our views. So that kind of basic exchange. So why I say it's hard to measure, particularly with these groups, some of which I kind of worked with as an advisorial capacity, is they were specifically targeting younger North Koreans, you know, who were not really seeing yet. But the fruits, when you ask for the fruits of that work, I think we're going to be seeing it, but it's still 10 or 20 years before those people kind of work up, you know, the North Korean system, which is still a very hierarchical system. The other thing is, with the South Korean efforts that Dong-Jin talked about, with these international efforts that I was aware of, it's a casualty of not just Trump's maximum pressure. Actually, well before that, under President Obama, the basic strategy has been just suffocate North Korea. You know, I mean, Dong-Jin laid out really well the South-South conflict and these two views of how to handle the problem. And there is a coherent strategy to that second view. But the result is that these groups who were going into North Korea or bringing North Koreans out of North Korea, it's become impossible for them to do that kind of work. I think ultimately really limiting the possibilities for long-term transformation of North Korea, so that there's more people within North Korea who could come to an event like this and talk with us, and we'll certainly have differences of view, but we'll be a lot closer than in North Korea that's just sealed off, you know, hermetically sealed off.
But from again, since you're, no offense to you, but I consider John just, you know, one of the preeminent experts on the strategic side. If you were, as Dong-Jin Kim said, to, you know, stop having this debate about is it a good idea, is it bad, about how to do it. So let's say you're with Secretary Pompeo or with the South Koreans or whomever, and you want to articulate not just it's a good idea, but how to go about it. What would you say?
Well, the first thing I would say is at that strategic level, the most important thing that's happened, say last year among all the summits, and more important than the missile tests from 2017 and the ones that have resumed, as you mentioned, Tom. To me, the most significant development last year was in April when Kim Jong-Un said, using the language of strategy, we now have a new strategy. The strategy of North Korea is all efforts on economic development. That's new. in my studies, I was teaching North Korean history at the time, and with my students, I said, okay, guys, find me an example of when his father or his grandfather ever said, it's the economy, stupid, right? That is truly, we're always thinking North Korea is always doing the same thing. That was not the same thing. That's not the North Korean playbook. And so that's what I would tell Secretary Pompeo. That's your opening, is that he has shifted to this focus on economic development. And so now you need to unleash groups like Korea Sharing Movement, groups like Chosun Exchange, based out of Singapore. That's actually the ground game to change the dynamics so that Kim Jong-un really can stay on this path of focusing on economic development, not focusing on nuclear weapons and missile technology. And so that's where I think the two come together. And civil society organizations have an absolutely critical role to play, but you have to give them room.
Right. Just on clearly the White House knows about the economic development because we know, I'm just thinking back to that, they didn't argue maybe for humanitarian, but they made that film about all the beaches and everything.
Trump Tower on one side, I know. So, but this is the problem. Here's where we get into the problem, is that my sort of understanding of how the White House thinks of this is, oh, great, he wants economic development, so now we have leverage. That's a carrot. We'll just hold that out, and we'll get him to do all the things we want him to do, namely give up his strategic deterrent, give up his nuclear weapons, give up his missile program. So that's his pot of gold at the end. But if you know North Korea, you know that's a very unrealistic basis for changing the relationship and changing the dynamics. It's not something Kim Jong-un he's not going to give you that leverage. Say, okay, I'll give up, my national security in exchange for the promise of a Trump Tower on a beach. You've got to move the two in sync. And that means you have to give room to the groups that are ready to go in there, especially Korean groups, South Korean groups, who have liberal values, who have just instinctive commitments to human rights, that view of the world, and can directly interact with the North Koreans in the same language and still a lot of shared culture with family linkages. That's a hugely powerful force for change, and we're not using it. We have a sanctions strategy that holds all that transformative power back.
Mm-hmm. Boy, a lot of questions, but here's a basic one for either one of you. Sure. I mentioned that it's just always useful to get beyond the headlines in the daily press. And even here, when we have conversations like these that I think offer some depth on the subject, we typically find ourselves either trying to digest what happened at a summit, or what the significance of missile launches and other activity. We really are typically focused on the stuff that you are commenting about in the daily press. So what are we missing in terms of information and news and things about whether in the North or the South? And I ask either one of you, what is the American public, or just the public that doesn't pay that much attention as you both do? What's going on that might surprise those in the room or me? A lot of things surprise me.
Yours?
I thought that I was kind of hoping that my presentation slides would surprise you, that the fact that the South Korean NGOs and the people were able to go to North Korea. Yeah. Unlike the myth that it's just in Korean language, there's a term called pajugi, which means just giving out the money to North Koreans, and then they would divert the aid for their use. But then the many South Korean NGOs, what they did in terms of their humanitarian cooperation work is that they went there themselves, worked with North Korean people there, and then the South Korean NGO staff members and then the people, the delegations who were on the monitoring visits, they were able to see the change of the heart from the North Korean side. But then that was blocked, again, not only by the international communities, but also by the North Korean regime as well. So, but then whenever there's a high-level peace process going on, then slide of the windows of opportunity happens for these South Korean NGO groups because of the rhetorics going on at the high level, and then they have to allow at least some sort of activities going on between North and South Korea. So either it's just small or big, or it's an agricultural project or Western project or medical project, South Korean NGO often allowed to go to visit North Korea. And then perhaps another thing about South Korean citizens is that we are under the national security law. So it's not North Koreans, it's the South Korean law prohibiting South Koreans to visit North Korea. So we have multiple gatekeepers, so South Korean government, North Korean government, international communities. So we are fighting against, not against, through this gatekeeping process to reach to the North Korean population. And we made it happen during those time of the peace process, which was fantastic. So people are quite nostalgic. You probably have remember some sort of scenes about family reunion types of events between North and South Korea. So that was like, the estranged family 70 years ago. But in terms of their work, the humanitarian work, they built such a relationship between North and South Koreans. Can you imagine the South Koreans going there with the shiny new tractors and the machines, and then the North Koreans were amazed by all these technologies, and then they were thrilled to have the joint project, and then the hearts giving out, and then building the relationships, and then suddenly it stopped. And then when people look back 10 years ago, even though they're not direct families, but they sort of felt, that we are fellow Koreans, and then it's long gone. And they don't get to meet with each other anymore. And then imagine how North Korean citizens, the North Korean population would feel that because, as you know, that the propaganda, they would think that this is all because of the outside world, including the United States, stopping this project. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say here is that it's also the responsibility of the North Korean government to make it happen, but we are also dealing with that fact as well. So perhaps that's the missing bit, I think.
Any things from your world that we should know about that we might not?
Well, the surprise was the tie. I already gave that away at the beginning. But no, I mean, I think that maybe we don't want to get into it because it's the rabbit hole of the main conversation. But I think we do all have to be aware. In the circles I move in, people are pretty pessimistic about where things are heading. And as far as the negotiation and as far as a path forward at the formal governmental level and at the negotiating level, one thing probably you're less aware of is just how everything has frozen in the inter-Korean relationship, whereas these, the charts that Dong-Jin showed, actually there was a lot of opening in 2018. So a lot of things were happening, very positive things were happening between the two Koreas on the ground. The blood was flowing again across through that artery. I visited the Ministry of Unification, the South Korean government agency in charge of that thing with a group visiting from the United States, and they said they had something like 60 exchanges between the North and the South last year. Most South Koreans weren't even aware, I don't think, of how much had resumed. South Korean journalists, friends of mine, would talk, oh yeah, I was in Pyongyang last week, they set up a tour. That's important. It's very important when South Korean journalists can visit North Korea and get a better understanding of some of the dynamics there. So I don't want to be Pollyanna here and say it just solves all the problems. It doesn't. But it's a long-term process, and you want to increase the value and also the quantity of those interactions. And so it was starting last year, and then it's just been completely frozen as a result of the North Korean government's choices, but also the South Korean government's choices and the U.S. government's choices. Sure. So I think the way Dong-Jin and I see this is we're not pointing the finger at one government. They're all screwing up together. And on the part of civil society actors, you're trying to create some space for this longer-term process that will ultimately actually help the governments achieve their goals.
Okay, I want to, go ahead.
Just quickly, well, again, that it's not just about the government. We admit that we acknowledge that, we also share the responsibility as a civil society in South Korea. Just for example, that we sort of knew that the tide has been changing. But we have been promising to the North Korean populations that we will do this project, we will do that other project, we will build a hospital, and we will provide aid. But in the end, the high-level peace process stops. We couldn't deliver. So we need to be also responsible, and we need a better strategy here.
But, well, so back to strategy, and I'm going to kind of re-ask something I just asked you, John, about you're in the Oval Office or wherever you might be where you have a moment to make the case. Because, you said government's screwing up together, but what's and obviously I guess it's a different case. Maybe we should put you in an office in Pyongyang also, just for the heck of it. But, so.
Get me out, please.
No, but okay, Kim Jong-Un, you need to do this. It's in your interest. Why? Okay, Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump, you need to do this. You need to, I mean, those are really different conversations, but what's the, not just, with all due respect to your excellent PowerPoint presentation, I don't think that's going to make the case really to those guys. So if you're going to move the needle or really, what's a case for the self-interest of those two sides?
Well, I'd start with Kim Jong-un, and actually, I do think there may be a difference if this process is able to move forward. What's in it for Kim Jong-un is economic development, and you talk about delivering on promises, delivering on his promise. The one good thing is he keeps promising economic development. I mean, the really bad thing is we hear him say, you know what, it's not going to work.
Right.
Forget that strategy. So he hasn't done that. He's adjusting, but he's sticking with the strategy of focusing on that. And so you make the case that if you're serious about delivering on that, you're going to have to get international partners. Chinese tourists aren't going to be enough to really transform North Korea, to get North Korea to catch up to the region, which North Koreans talk about, catching up. There's going to have to be a process of integrating your country with South Korea, with even Japan. It's already somewhat integrated with China, but with places like Singapore and Vietnam, where Kim Jong-un, visited. We focused only on his summit with Trump, but I think there was a strategic reason why he's going to those countries and having bilateral meetings. So that's the real transformation in North Korea that I think he's talking about, and he needs to do what he has to do on his side to give room to these groups to really start that process and make it a sustainable one. It's a tougher argument for Donald Trump. I mean, because with Kim Jong-un, you are talking about kind of the fate of his country, and his political fortunes are invested in delivering on his promise of economic development. Whereas, for Donald Trump, North Korea is just one issue of a lot. And how much, I know this is something that South Koreans and North Koreans care a lot about and debate a lot about. I'd be curious views in this room. How much does Donald Trump, or the American public for that matter, really care about North Korea?
Well, he staked a pretty, large amount of his own time, bandwidth, and the things he said, particularly after the first summit.
Yeah.
I don't know, could you not make the case that, hey, here's an avenue to really justify some of the things you said and to get some sort of victory or whatever? I mean, I don't know.
I think that would be it. The thing about this stuff, the reason it's probably not as compelling for Donald Trump is this is not flashy, showy stuff. This is not symmetry and drama. And also, actually, you're going to take a hit. People in Washington, and I was there last week, the Washington kind of foreign policy establishment, not like here in New York, where folks are much more enlightened about things, but down in Washington, they're going to slam a lot of, if what we're talking about started to actually materialize, it would be harshly criticized. Because all they would say is, oh, they're lifting sanctions, Trump's weak. He's getting
the enemy, right?
Yeah, and he's getting used, Kim Jong-un's running circles around him. Fall right into that narrative. I can write the CNN Chiron or whatever that's called for them. So actually he could take a real hit in terms of the spin of it. And again, the fruit is long term. This is not a quick payoff type of strategy.
Right.
So that may be why it's hard for it to get traction.
And I guess just one thing would be that just to, highlight the needs for promoting the work of the South Korean NGOs would be helpful, because in terms of North Korea, it is the reason why they still allow us to talk to our partners in North Korea is that there were many reasons why it happened, but during the Sunshine Era, but it happened. Mm-hmm. So still there is a memory in North Korea. And despite the fact that we see the authoritarian regime and dictatorship, it's a human society.
Yep.
So the human population there, they have memory of the, and then also good feeling about this South-North cooperation. But, so that's why they come to us and then ask us to do this and that and that. So the regime cannot really, say no to all those initiatives, but they can say that it's blocked not by us. It can blocked by the international sanctions and the U.S. sanctions. Right. So breaking down that myth is, I think, the important thing, and then keep talking with the high levels people to understand what we do. It's not their priority at all. I understand, and we understand that denuclearization is really important. And then international security is important, and civil and political rights is important. But just to let them remember that this is also the side, and then at least don't limit these activities. Right. And then it's not, so it doesn't have to be the collateral damage all the time.
Sure. Yeah. You want to push the button? If you could just introduce yourself from the KSM.
I wasn't invited as a speaker here.
You're more than welcome.
Yeah, I'm co-standing president of Korean Sharing Movement. And I've been going North Korea for the humanitarian aid since 1989.
89.
So, 89. So it's exactly 30 years since I started. But far before that, I was born in North Korea. And I was raised as a separate family. And then I joined my family in South. But I still have my cousins live up there. And I brought my father to North Korea and spent a few days in my cousin's house. I'm telling this story because there is something missing here.
Yeah.
The understanding. How much do you understand North Koreans? I think that's the key, because experts, they seem to know North Koreans, but to me, they're not. Yeah. They're not. We're talking about blood flow, so south and north. Even Dong-Jin was born far after the yeah. Dong-Jin's father even born after the division. So. Someone who lived up in North Korea, was born and raised and lived in North Korea, and also has a very blood close tie in North Korea, has a different understanding than someone who doesn't have that relationship.
Sure.
In short, to me, I know Kim Jong-un will never give up his nuclear weapon. Never. But everybody seems like, if we do this, we do that, yeah. He will. I know he will not. And I'm very agree with him, because no one in North Korea trusts the United States. And the United States has responsibility on that, mistrust also. And so last year I went there 3 times. But my last 30 years, last year was the best year I ever seen the change of North Korea. You know why?
Why?
Anyone know why? What was the difference? No one even think of U.S. Korean Army exercises how much of it affects North Koreans' life. Because if you were in North Korea and during that period of time, military exercise, everybody is under war.
Everybody is what?
Under war, real war. And no one seems to know all this emotional fear and all those impact. And last year there was no single joint exercises.
Right. And that was what changed the mood. Yeah.
It was totally different. Their expression was different, everything was different.
Yeah.
But this year, starting April, they start again.
Right.
That it is against the what we call 427.
24/7.
For April 27.
Ah, okay, sorry.
Yeah,
The
to submit-
inter-Korean
Yeah.
agreement. Yeah.
Who broke that? Actually, under that, the memorandum or whatever,
Yeah, yeah.
there will be no such exercises. But that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
No one even in South Korea, no one knows even there is joint exercises happening. Because no one give attention to that.
Right.
But for North Koreans, it's totally different.
Yeah. Thank you. When did you, may I ask, how old you were when you left North Korea?
6 years old.
6 years old. Okay. Well, thank you, and thank you for those reflections. I just have one other question, but it sort of pales in comparison to that, and then we'll go to the room, which has also to do with changes inside North Korea. We had Anna Fifield here, the Washington Post, now she's the bureau chief in Beijing, not long ago, and she's written a book about North Korea and has been there many, many times. And she said that, I guess her answer to the question of what we are missing is just that particularly in the last, I guess, 2-3 years, she sees all sorts of changes in terms of, I guess, the living style, for lack of a better word, in terms of the way people dress, the cosmetics that women have, the kind of little things that you have to read like tea leaves about, and the availability, even though it's obviously clandestine, of all these South Korean television shows and all that. How big a sort of change is that really, and how does it impact? Because if this is not really economic development, but if it's making people, in the North feel better, have a slightly improved life, does it allow the leadership to say, okay, things are getting better, and not have to say yes to things like the KSM is pushing? I don't know who wants to. How important are those changes?
I believe it is very important, and then because Kim Jong-un is trying to show his population that he's making the progress, and then in some way or the other that he is making the progress in terms of the economic development. So it shows how effective our sanctions could be in North Korea. But at the same time, UN reports, the humanitarian needs reports every year. The humanitarian situation is the same.
Yep.
They keep reporting that about half of the population are undernourished, and they need the support. And then about 25% of the population are malnourished, and then they need support. So where are these vulnerable people who are invisible from our lens? And then we keep hearing these things, and we get used to these sort of stories, so we forget. But then we see the shiny changes in Pyongyang, but then we don't recognize that. But of course, I'm not blaming the governments, concerned government, including North Korea, for all those things that happen. But then because we are focusing on these aspects, and then perhaps we are missing the points that this is the country, like Professor Lee rightly pointed out, have been suffering from the security issues, and then the regime is prioritizing the regime security over these vulnerable populations. And then I think we need to put more attention to this fact as well.
Yeah, just real quickly, that phenomenon, it predates Kim Jong-un, but he's tacitly encouraged, not tacitly, he's actually explicitly encouraged it, and kind of politically identified with the leisure class of Pyongyang. But you also, if you study the tea leaves and look at the messages he sends, even recently, probably you saw he was on the white horse. That seems to have went a little viral globally. But if you looked at the speeches that he was giving after the horse ride, he was traveling to economic sites around the country. And even in those explicit and reported statements, he would talk about how, I know things aren't very good. There's a lot of hardship. And also, the country is a lot more developed in Pyongyang than really anywhere else. And so, he's dealing with unequal development. I mean, that's a problem for Kim Jong-un, just like for countries really around the world. So I think that it's not just a purely positive phenomenon that he can bank on to kind of get him through.
I'm delayed in coming to the room. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Georgi Teleraya. Currently working in the panel of experts at the UN, but I'm speaking here in my personal capacity. And speaking about North Korea, first time came there 42 years ago, and the last time was there this May this year. And there are tremendous changes, and I want just to let everybody understand what I think about it. Of course, the social differentiation in North Korea is maybe now more than any other, more or less developed country. I watched, for example, in my country, I'm from Russia, I watched how these reforms were going on. And if you go to Moscow, you will see a shining European city, very pleasant, now very beautiful. But if you go to countryside, you will see people who are rather poor. And I think that in North Korea now, the difference is about the same magnitude, if not more.
Income inequality. Yep.
Income inequality, yes, and Gini coefficient, things like that. And if we speak about sanctions, unfortunately, they mostly affect the lower part of population. And I think it's very important that the humanitarian organizations, NGO, concentrate their job on this part of population, because they have no other way to survive. Yeah. There's no state support for them, or it's very, very small. They cannot, get the money themselves, so they're very vulnerable. And I think it's very important, the job you are doing and hopefully will be doing. Thank you.
Just out of curiosity, how many people in this room have been to North Korea? Well, raise your hands, come on. Yeah, okay, that's good. There was a question here. Bill, did you have one?
Bill Rayford. How is China engaged with North Korea? They're building bridges literally around the world. Building bridges. I don't just mean the Communist Party relationship, which I assume is still very close. With North Korea with respect to this program.
Yeah. Well, the relationship was very bad for 5 or 6 years. Kim Jong-un, was one of the real striking features of Kim Jong-un is that he did nothing to get along with Xi Jinping. Quite the opposite. He really angered Xi Jinping. And so that was part of how the United States, that the Trump administration was able to get a lot more pressure from China. And that peaked by the end of 2017 and going into 2018. And that did create restrictions and really tightened the restrictions on North Korea's basic economic, livelihood. So now it's harder to see, but I mean, this last year, things have really changed. Kim Jong-un, of course, has made 4 trips in 12 months to meet with Xi Jinping in different parts of China, which his grandfather never made that many trips in a year. And then he got Xi Jinping to visit in June. Xi visited Pyongyang for the first time in 14 years, that the sitting Chinese leader. And so that is rippling down. You can see across the board, the different parts of the North Korean system and the Chinese system are meeting again. But it's hard to answer your question in terms of the amount of aid and also even the real volume of economic activity between China and North Korea. Even before sanctions was always hard to measure because a lot of it is unreported. But one thing I would say overall, I mean, North Korea sent a delegation to the Belt and Road Initiative, conference, which is significant, but it's still at that level of signaling and symbolism. The big bridge that the Chinese built, for example, across the border is not active. So major Chinese investment has not started to flow into North Korea. And Kim Jong-un is probably, those first 5 years I think are important. I think he's wary of China. and would be wary, of Chinese capital flowing in at too great a volume, because ultimately that would be actually quite threatening to his economic interests. So he's holding it at bay at some point, and the Chinese have reason to withhold it.
So we've gotten a few questions from the folks watching online, and one is, it keeps us in terms of the region and the neighbors. Question for Dr. Delury. Okay. Is there engagement with the North Koreans in Japan? There's a sizable population there. What role do they play, if at all? Could be for either one of you, I guess.
Yeah, there may be someone else in the room who's an expert on this. There is a large presence of Korean-Japanese well-established community in Japan, and historically they've actually had deep ties to North Korea. A large group of them in the late 1950s traveled back, so reconnecting divided families. And even through to the late 1990s, Japan was one of, if not by some measures, the top trading partner of North Korea. But a similar thing happened in Japan as far as based on from the late 90s, it was with missile testing, and then it continued, where Japan, even unilaterally, has done a lot to restrict that flow. So it does exist, and there's basically a North Korean organization that's quite influential among that community of Korean Japanese that play an important role. And so there are contacts there. A lot of them are a little bit under the radar, but they exist. But more broadly, Japanese companies aren't active in North Korea, and
They're not very active in South Korea right now, right?
No, that's a different
That's
panel.
a whole other discussion. Okay, Josetta, yeah.
Yes. Josetta Capriati, Foreign Policy Association. I remember when I went to the DMZ 2 years ago with a delegation from the Korea Society, somebody pointed out that the 3 North Korean guards on one side of the room were shorter and thinner than their South Korean counterparts on the other side of the room. So talking about malnutrition. But my question is about concentration camps. It took Ban Ki-moon 5 years in office to have the UN finally release the document about the concentration camps in North Korea, where 200,000 people live like slaves, are tortured, etc., etc. After that, nobody has done anything. The UN, the European Union, nobody. Why?
Give that to Dong-Jin.
Dong-Jin gets all the easy ones. Yeah.
So thank you for your question and raising these issues. And my answer is that, well, it's not too surprising to hear about North Korean human rights situation, because we all know that North Korean regime is an authoritarian regime, and then they have human rights issues. And several years ago, well, I am currently based in Dublin, Ireland, but I was based in Seoul, and then I was asked by one of the human rights activists from Vienna, Austria, about the question of the North Korean human rights violation about the concentration camp. And because I work with the humanitarian NGOs, and then he was sort of asking me why you are doing the work with North Koreans when there are people in the concentration camp suffering. So what you need to do is that you have to give more sanctions, and you have to bring up these issues all the more. And then my answer was that because of the peace-building activities between North and South Korea, and then we think that this would be the more effective way to resolve that issues. That was my answer. And then the person told me that you are somebody, I don't want to accuse you of being a coward, but you are risking the human rights situation getting worse in North Korea because you want peace with North Korea.
This is what he said to you.
Yeah, so my answer was that thank you very much. I know that the Vienna is the most beautiful city in the world. And then the people listed Vienna at the time, the one of the most beautiful city that people want to live. So my answer was that for us, it is a dire issue to improve North Korean human rights because they are our fellow Koreans. But it is very important to build peace with North Korea as a South Koreans, to be able to achieve the improvement of North Korean human rights, as well as our rights to live in security in South Korea. But it doesn't have to be, again, that as I was saying, incompatible. My answer would be that we need to find the way to do it together. Instead of vilifying others, the humanitarian actors are the one who's helping North Korean regimes. I don't believe that that is true. Or human rights actors are trying to vilify North Korean regimes. I don't believe that's true. So one way to resolve this would be that the international community keep bringing up these issues so that the North Korean regimes could feel the pressure from the international communities that they need to make the change. But from the perspective of the South Koreans, that if we do this, it can be considered as a psychological warfare, and then the North Korean regime could use it as a propaganda that human rights is just a fodder to attack us because we are at war with North Korea, currently still according to the armistice regime. So I think that we share the same goal, but we have to be smarter. We have heart and passion, and we are angry about our issues, and because we are so passionate about our values, but sometimes because we are promoting one value over the other, sometimes it doesn't achieve our desired goal.
I'm reminded just listening, and thank you for that question, because it doesn't come up enough. But you used the term rabbit holes a few moments ago. And in a way, I feel like this is a discussion not only about North Korea, but we have around the world, to the gentleman's point about how the people, when you open the gates for humanitarian aid, is it only going to be, the well-to-do who get the benefits, or if you close the doors and you sanction the country, is it only the poor who are going to be hurt? And in this case, it's an age-old discussion, and there's a very strong and articulate answer I think you just gave about whether when there are atrocities, does that mean you shut the door and punish only, or do you open up and try what you've tried? But I mean, how does this stop being a rabbit hole and become I guess it's another way of asking a question I asked earlier, and become something that gets us somewhere? Because we can argue, we and the people who are influencers argue those two sides forever.
Yeah, I don't have solutions to this either. I mean, I would echo. I think Dong-Jin handled that difficult question, important question, well, in terms of there's different role for different groups, and that these can be complementary. Although each actor is making decisions about what they focus on. I mean, the way I've approached North Korea, I've not focused on the human rights, the kind of hard human rights issues, including the prison camps. Because to me, I care about that, I learn about it, I follow it, but to me the critical question is what's going to make those camps smaller, if not eliminate? And then it gets back to the earlier point of there's two basic strategies of how to deal with this thing. One is, kind of walk away, as Dong-Jin said, or strangle it until the regime disappears, and then the camps should be liberated. And it's just never, and still to me, that does not seem like a plausible and realistic approach. And so I put my energy into the other approach, which is to change it gradually by making the whole thing, the whole system, feel less insecure and afraid, and therefore focused on control, including controlling populations like are in those camps. But it would be a lie to say I'm not making a kind of tragic choice. In that. That pains me at times as well. It's not easy.
Can I answer that question, please? Yeah.
Let's just try to take, maybe
sure.
we'll just get two questions together, and we'll answer those and stay faithful to the time. Yes, sir, and then, yeah.
Shoni Song at Columbia University and a research intern here at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for your presentation, and it's good to see you again. Professor Delury, I was a student back at Yonsei University.
Oh, wow.
So I think interesting point you made about some of the barriers that exist in the way of sort of inter-Korean interactions and engagement, especially the point you made about South-South conflict. I think that's the way you phrased it. And I guess that's your way of saying, South Korea's sort of national security policy and so on and so forth really sort of acts as a hurdle to some of the inter-Korean engagement that could be happening. My question is, some of the interesting surveys that's coming out of South Korea show that young South Koreans in their 20s and 30s are the most conservative anti-Korean, along with people in their 60s and 70s. And I don't blame them necessarily, because people my age in South Korea grew up sort of watching, some of the most egregious acts of provocation from the North. The 2010 sort of, we know the sinking of RKS Cheonan, 2014 shelling of the Yeonpyeong Island, 2015 the landmine provocation. So my question is, how do we sort of reverse that trend? Because it's an interesting demographic that we have to sort of capture, I think, if we want to pursue engagement in any sort of constructive manner. But how do we sort of reverse that trend demographically and politically?
Okay, so hardline South Koreans among the young, and yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your insights and presentations. My name is Young Kim, also from Columbia SIPA. And my question is to Dr. Delury. So last year, I had the opportunity to work with BBC Korea to cover the very first Inter-Korean Summit, and we interviewed Dr. Delury, and he was there. We couldn't film all the way near the DMZ, so we could get as close as we could. And back then, it was very positive. The moods were great, and all the rosy future and festivities and positive coming future that we hoped for. But now we're in 2019, October, and back then it was, the first Inter-Korean Summit produced, I believe it was near the 80% approval ratings for the President Moon. That's how positive we were back then. But right now, October 2019, what we're seeing, I know most of you here already read the news that yesterday morning it was North Korea firing another 2 unidentified projectiles. And it's, I believe, the 14th time this year alone, the provocation. And given that, and also not to mention that President Moon lost his mother, and during that funeral time period that they had to launch projectiles again, and given that, how can we possibly sell that agenda that we need to build peace with North Korea, given the settings, to the international community and to Washington, D.C.?
Okay. Who wants to go first, and which question first? Hardline youth?
Yeah.
What do we do about that?
I can go for it.
Go ahead,
Sure.
yeah,
Sure,
they're kind of
great.
related. In a
Yeah,
way.
sure. So as I said, that I live in Ireland, currently in Dublin, but until September, I was based in Belfast. So I am there to research comparatively on the Northern Irish peace process and the Korean peace process.
Wow.
But one of the yes, thank you for your encouraging. Well, one thing I learned when I was living in Belfast was that we do have contact theory, and particularly as the peace builders and the peace building communities, that we want to increase the contact between people. By increasing interaction between people, our assumption is that people will find each other's humanity, and then perhaps build peace. But when you look at Northern Ireland, I'm not the expert in Northern Irish peace process, but it's just sort of the observation from the outside with the Korean engine. Was the one thing I realized was that even though still it is a valuable effort and it's a viable option, but without preparation for that interaction and context, sometimes if you increase context, you get to increase the hatred all the more. So when you didn't meet with each other, you have the myth and perception that these other peoples are the enemies. When you get to meet with each other and then you get verified, you confirm that this guy was really bad people. These people are indeed bad. So I think that in the way of the context, for example, in the Korean Peninsula, is that the so-called P generations and patriotic generations and the generation in Korea, particularly those who served in the military, their contact is negative with North Koreans. And then also, even though that we encourage people to meet with North Koreans, then that contact also be quite negative because of the human rights issues and other issues as well. So I think that as important as the interactions could be, the peace education within South Korean societies and preparing the youth, and then particularly the self-awareness in the context why the Korean context is here and why now, that is also kind of the important. But it goes to your question as well. Like if anyone who, whether it's human rights organizations, humanitarian organizations, high-level negotiators and such, I think that by getting to know together about the context well, then perhaps it can affect and have a positive effect in our implementation of our mandate, whether it's a human rights project or humanitarian project. So putting that into consideration in our project could be one way of collaborating with each other, just like the UN strategic framework in North Korea.
So last words, John Delury, what the
Yeah.
euphoria of 18 months ago, how do you sell this given what's happened since?
Yeah. Well, and first on the students, I want to comment on that. Since Dong-Jin's off in Ireland, he doesn't know what young people in Korea think anymore. But I've been there for 9 years teaching at Yonsei. It's good to see you again, Sean. And but one thing I would point out that complicates, I think, your premise a little bit is there's quite a split on gender lines. So young men are very conservative and have those negative attitudes, but women in their 20s and 30s tend not to. And actually, that goes to a bigger conversation, and Dong-Jin is much more qualified since he served in the South Korean military to talk about it. But the main reason for that is really the socialization process, because South Korea has universal male conscription. And I see that with my students. My male students come back from their military service with much harder line attitudes. It goes to this point about contact. That's their first contact with North Korea. And they're taught about North Korea when they're learning how to use a gun, how to shoot it as a North Korean. Wow. So I think there's a major gender factor. The solution would be to get rid of universal male conscription, or teach South Korean soldiers to love their
Or
enemy.
have universal female conscription, too.
That would probably just make the problem worse, but it would probably good for gender equality, bad for inter-Korean relations. And to your question, it's great to see you again. You know this, still, if you look at the polling, one thing about Moon's approach of engagement is consistently it's got a lot of public support, almost surprisingly, I think, in South Korea. And the reason that his overall public support has dropped way down to 40 doesn't have too much to do with North Korea. It's mostly economic and social issues, including gender issues and a lot of other problems in South Korea. So I think that's relevant because, of course, Moon would love to have something positive and wants very much, desperately, it's getting very frustrated, the atmosphere in Seoul. So he would want to get that process going. He would want to pay attention to it for pure political reasons because it's overall a winning issue, despite the fact that young males tend to be very conservative. And of course, there's still a core conservative viewpoint among older people in South Korea. But overall, the South Korean public is ready for this, I think. That's what we saw last year. So I think that takeaway still holds true.
Thanks to you both. Before we say farewell for this morning, I'm reminded in my calendar brain it is November. And just a couple of notes about November and December offerings. Those of you who are members will have gotten our events brochure, but off the top of my head, and Sanjeev and John, you'll correct me if I get my dates wrong. November the 18th, we move to another part of the world that we care about that is having its own share of problems, a program called Whatever Happened in Burma, with the great scholar, author, and a lot of other things, Tan Minh Oo, among other things, grandson of the former Secretary General. He's got a new book out about his native country. That's the 18th. On the 2nd of December, the Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent for ABC News, Martha Raddatz, will be here for a talk about her work across many hot zones and flashpoints in Asia. And then on the 18th, I believe, is our annual year-end, very freewheeling forecast of what's to come, in this case in 2020 in Asia. I thank you again, and special thanks to Dong-Jin Kim and John Delury. It's great to have you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.